Good morning, or afternoon, or evening, or whatever time it is. Welcome back to Civics at Home. Now, for the next 2 weeks, the last 2 weeks of the regular season school year, well, it's not a regular season, is it? But before exam week, which we'll do something different, we'll be covering United States history from the 20th century. I've said it before, and I will probably say it again. It's really not so good that you do not hear and learn about this stuff in school unless you take AP US History, APUSH, in high school. You hear mentioned here and there, but not like a whole thing of what happened in the 20th century, which is terrible. This is when the United States grew into the country it is today. Stuff that affects you the most happened in the 20th century. Your parents and grandparents and great-grandparents were all alive during this time, so it affected them directly. Maybe they were involved. So it's really important you hear about this stuff, and so that's what we'll do. Now, do not think you have to write down every little thing that I say, every year, everything. That is not the point. The point is that you get a nice overview of what happened in the 20th century, so that somebody talks about the Great Depression, World War II, or the invention of radio, or the Cold War, you know what it is a little bit. You don't have to be an expert, just know what it is. So when you take your EDSB quizzes and other assessments this week, I can say that, it won't be a little detailed thing like what year was radio invented. No, but a question like how did most people get their news and entertainment in the 1930s? Well, then you would know that's radio, and that's a very general question. That's the kind of questions you'll get, so you'll generally know what's going on. So let's generally jump right in. And speaking of jumping, a lot of the story has to do with the acceleration of technology, how fast things have changed in how we communicate, how we get places, how a lot of things are done. Technology changes a lot about everyday life. And I'll give you some examples. But first, let's go back a little bit farther. Go back to 1800. And you see that picture there from Williamsburg? That's a place where people dress up like they did back in those days and kind of show you how life was like. And if you live like that, though, you're living pretty good, because that's a wagon with two horses, and you got a driver, and in the back you got an actual carriage with like doors and a roof. That's pretty good stuff. Most people couldn't afford that. Most people, if you're going to get around by land, you could ride on a horse, you go in a carriage or a wagon, some kind of farm wagon, something like that, and that was it. Or you could, of course, walk. Well, you could jog or run, I suppose, if you want. But that's the only way to get around. There was no trains, no cars, no anything else. You had to travel on foot or with an animal helping you along. And so communication was kind of like that too. You could obviously go talk to people, but you had to actually get to them. If you wanted to send a letter, that's fine. You could write it down, but to deliver it, it was done by somebody on an animal, somebody on foot. It was really slow. Same thing with books, newspapers. Sure, you could buy books or get newspapers from other places, but you either had them hand delivered or somebody, would put them on a horse and ride them somewhere else. So communication was really slow. It was even more slow by water because ships sailed along and pushed by the wind, and that was about it. Or oars, I suppose. So if the wind's blowing in the wrong direction, you won't make it. If a storm comes, well, you might just sink. And it would take a couple of months to get across the Atlantic Ocean, which is really slow for communicating, obviously. Also, traveling by air is not going to happen unless you happen to be a bird, but not even a penguin, a bird that can fly. Let's go forward 100 years to 1900. That is an actual picture from New York City, a parade in 1900. It might seem like there's a bunch of cars there, but looks can be deceiving. There is not a bunch of cars there. There is one, and the car is right there. That's the only car in the picture. Everything else is being pulled by a horse, which shows you that, yeah, technology had changed, but cars were new, kind of experimental, kind of expensive, and so most people didn't have them yet, but it was a thing. Obviously, cameras were invented in the middle of the 1800s, or else you wouldn't have an actual picture, but that is an actual picture. So traveling by road, cars were very primitive, but trains, that's how you would travel. Hop on a train, go across the country. It really cut down travel times. No more, if you're going across the country before trains, you're going in a wagon or you're walking, like across the Oregon Trail. Now you could hop on a train and get across the entire country in less than a week. Way shorter than it had been in the old days. Communication. By this time, there was telegraph. You cannot talk on the phone across the country yet, but a telegraph, you can run a wire across the country, and by hitting a button on one station, you can send a series of little buzzes to another station. And if somebody knows Morse code, the buzzes would form out your Morse code and it could say what the message is. So you could communicate within an hour or so across the country, which is a huge difference. You don't actually physically get there. Now you communicate via wire pretty quickly. Telephones were around, but they were very primitive. Not very many people had them, and the range was pretty short in 1900. Same thing with radios. Radios were even more primitive, and people didn't have radios and to listen to or whatever. They were just experimental at that point. Traveling by water had improved quite a bit because now you had steam-powered ships, so the wind couldn't hold you back as much. It hold you back some, but not much. You get across the Atlantic Ocean in a couple of weeks when it used to take 2 or 3 months. Big difference. And traveling by air, not yet, but almost. In 1903, the first time a plane actually left the ground, a powered plane. And there's your powered plane. 1903, the Wright brothers. That is not the very first plane. That is an early Wright brothers plane, though. And you can see it's basically a kite with a little engine on it. And it could go short distances. But before long, you go longer distances. In about 12 years after the first plane flew, there were planes fighting in World War One, buzzing around each other and shooting at each other. So, I mean, shooting at each other is not very cool, but they could actually fly. They were relatively reliable. Big jump in only a few years. And of course, the parachute. That's an important thing to have if you have a plane. Stainless steel might not seem like much, but a lot of things are made out of stainless steel. It's a really good material for building stuff, and it was only invented in 1913. If you look in your silverware drawer, pick up a fork, pick up a spoon. It probably says stainless steel on it. It's a great material for making all kinds of stuff. All right, so the first radio station was in 1920. We'll talk about that in a minute. Not very many listeners at first. Next one, the first rotary oh, there's the radio, by the way. They didn't actually dance like that in your house because that would be creepy. The first rotary telephone system. You might look at that and think, wow, that looks pretty old and old-fashioned. Yeah, but in 1919, that was cutting-edge technology. Before that, if you wanted to call somebody, there was no numbers on your phone. You would pick it up, and an operator would ask who you wanted to call, and you tell them. Later on, when a lot of people had phones, you had to actually say a number, and they would physically, the operator would get a wire and plug it in from your phone to their phone down at the switching station, and then it would connect to the other person's phone, and you could talk. Really slow, and not very advanced at all, and it costs a lot of money to run that kind of system. But now you can dial it yourself. It made it so you could talk to people faster, and even more importantly, it made it a lot cheaper to sell up a telephone system, which means more people could afford it. So the number of people that actually had phones in their homes started to grow in the 20s. Also in the 20s, the first movie with sound. Steamboat Willie was not the first movie with sound. Matter of fact, it wasn't technically the first cartoon with sound, but it was the first one that became popular where you actually had, on the film is the sound as well. So it's all synced up and his mouth isn't moving and nothing happens, and then you hear the voice later. No, it's all synced up. Before sound movies, there were silent movies, which means they're silent. So when somebody talked, a card would pop up and show what they said, and it was a lot of melodrama and people just acting with big arm gestures and such, because you don't want to have so many cards showing and you have to read the whole movie. And it was completely silent. So if you wanted music with your movie, theaters would pay people to sit at a piano inside the movie theater to play something on the piano that went along with the action on the screen. It had to be played live because you could not connect it with the movie at first. And so by the late 20s, talkies, those are movies with sound, became extremely popular, and silent movies kind of died out. Also, the first transatlantic phone call was in 1926. It was a call from New York to London. And it was, you could barely hear them, but you could hear them, and that changed everything. Now you didn't have a ship that took 2 weeks to get a message. Now you could instantly call them. And they ran a cable underneath the bottom of the entire Atlantic Ocean to make that happen. And there still are cables running across the entire Atlantic Ocean to connect the internet right now, but let's not jump ahead of things. And within a few years, that became more common to make long-distance phone calls all over the world. It was really expensive at the time, but you could do it if you really wanted to. And the first transatlantic plane flight was that guy, Charles Lindbergh. That's the Spirit of St. Louis, the plane actually taking off from New York, trying to head to France. And he made it, spoiler, but he almost didn't because it had a lot of extra fuel to make that really long flight. And the plane was kind of heavy, and as you can see, it had trouble getting off the ground and almost hit some trees down at the end of the runway. But it cleared the trees by a few feet, which is good, and he made it 20-some hour flight. Within a few years, that flight had been cut down to just a few hours, and you could buy a ticket to go across, not some experimental airplane like Charles Lindbergh flew. So again, things change pretty quickly. And besides inventions, obviously lots of stuff happened in the early 1900s as well. Let me jump back a little bit farther. 1898, the U.S. won the Spanish-American War, which made it like, hey, we're an up-and-coming new country, the one to watch, because we just defeated Spain and started our own little empire. If you look at that picture carefully, you'll see that is the University of Tampa, the porch in front of it. At the time, it was a Tampa Bay hotel. And because Tampa was a place where a lot of soldiers went down to fight in the Spanish-American War, went down to Cuba from here, that place was absolutely packed with a lot of officers and with a lot of reporters and all kinds of officials as they were getting ready to go down there. And so the porch looks almost like it does now, except for the rocking chairs. They don't have rocking chairs right now, and that is a shame. And after that, World War I. The United States wasn't involved till near the end, but World War I was really horrific in Europe. And we came in and helped push one side to victory. But for Europe, it was pretty awful. It was pretty badly ripped up. Also, during the same time, many things happened in 1917 and 18. Was this in Russia? They had been in World War I as well, and the government collapsed because things are going so badly in the country, and they had a revolution, and a bunch of communists took over the country, and they combined with a couple of nearby countries and formed the Soviet Union. And those people will show up many times as we talk about the 20th century. Also, after World War I, President Woodrow Wilson, I've heard that name before, had the idea of a League of Nations to keep another world war from happening. And as we talked about in class, he really wanted us to join it. It was his idea, and the U.S. Senate said, no, we do not ratify the treaty, and they refused. And so that's a really famous cartoon, the League of Nations trying to build a bridge of peace, but the United States refusing to put that last piece in there to keep it all together, and it did fall apart, spoiler, in World War II. So would World War II have been avoided if we would have joined? It's hard to say, but maybe. 1920, the 19th Amendment gave women the right to vote. Again, 100-year anniversary this year. Celebrations are going to be a lot muted. We can do a big Zoom celebration, yay? I don't know. But yeah, that's a great thing. And when more people can vote, more voices are heard in democracy, which is a good thing. This was a bad thing, actually. The Great Depression, as we talked about a few weeks ago, started in 1929. It got worse in 1930, 31. A lot of people out of work. Really, really tough times in the U.S. and around the world, but in the U.S. is what we focused on a few weeks ago. And again, you might have seen in the news how the unemployment in the United States right now is the highest it's been since the Great Depression, which is not good. The good news is that we know the cause. I mean, businesses are closed because of the whole coronavirus thing, and everybody's locked down. So you would think as soon as that passes, that businesses and jobs will pick up again. That's the hope. In the Great Depression, there was not one cause. You can say when this gets better, then everything's going to be better. So it was kind of harder to fight out of the Great Depression, and it lasted a while. And one where we fought out of it was Franklin Roosevelt was elected president in 32, became president in 33, and he gave his famous inaugural speech, "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself," he said, saying, "Oh, come on, everybody, let's get through this." And Congress started passing the New Deal, his program for getting us out of it, and things slowly improved, as we talked about a few weeks ago. Not so good. 1933 also, Adolf Hitler took charge of Germany. And eventually started rattling some sabers and rebuilding the German army and starting to make threats on the neighbors. And as we'll talk about later, that eventually led to World War II, but no spoilers. All right, now enough of the big wars and stuff. Let's go back to pop culture and how people lived in everyday life. Radio, as I said, was invented, late 1800s really, but it became able to be used more in the early 1900s, where you could actually send voice. And then 1920, the first radio station went into service, and that changed a lot. That the big radio, their antenna looking out over the great American plains, it was the first way to mass communicate with a lot of people all at once. And the golden age of radio lasted from about 1920 to 1960, as you shall see. All right, so again, you don't have to memorize all this stuff, but a little bit of background. The first radio transmitters were invented by Nikola Tesla and Guglielmo Marconi, who has a great Italian name, in the late 1800s. There's Nikolai, how you doing? And they were both working at the same time, kind of rivals, but they both had made good contributions to making radio actually work. But they had very short ranges until 1900, only a few miles, not very long at all. So they were good for ships maybe, and that's one way they were first used is from ships to ships or from shore to ship, and not only with voice, because if you could just make static again and make a little buzzing sound and buzz in a Morse code, then you could send a message that way without having to actually speak. So that's how it was used in the old days. But eventually you could do voice and you could do music. The quality wasn't great, but you could hear what was going on. And so that is when the first radio station went on the air in 1920 in Pittsburgh, of all places. And so at first there was only about 2,000 people listening to the early stations. The next year there was 300,000 people listening to the first live sports broadcast on radio was a heavyweight championship boxing match. And if you see that radio there on the right, that's what they look like in the early days. You kind of had to put them together yourself. They were kind of experimental, cutting edge technology during the 20s. In the 1930s, though, in the 1930s, more people, it got simple, they got cheaper, and more people could just buy them, not have to put them together. And so people started hearing news in their own homes. Like Franklin Roosevelt, he gave fireside chats where he explained what was going on, first in the Depression, and then later on in World War II, explaining what was going on. And that was kind of must listen to program when he was explaining what's going on and really kind of being the calming voice for the nation. Also, as World War II was starting to brew in Europe, people could hear live broadcasts as it was happening. So in 1940, Germany was bombing London like terribly day after day. And you could hear on the radio live broadcasts where people saying, yes, this is what's going on. And there's a boom in the background. Like, yeah, there goes another bomb, which really brought it into people's homes and also made people think, hey, maybe we should help the English because they're really getting clobbered over there right now. People would listen and sit and stare at the radio like that, which seems a little weird because there's no screen there. But I guess you got to look at something since it is the theater of the mind, and it's all in your head. But you got to look at something. So I guess you can stare at the radio box. The 1930s was the golden age of radio. As it says, in 1930, there was about 1,000 stations and about 12 million radios out there. Now, even though the Depression made it so people couldn't afford much, they bought radios. They were not that expensive, and they wanted some entertainment. They wanted to be connected. And so in just 5 years, another 10 million radios were out there. And it just became a thing people did. The family would sit around the radio at night and listen to their favorite program. And there were so many programs to listen to. Anything you can think of, it was on the radio. So today, if you want to watch something, on Netflix, whatever, I'll give you your genre. All those genres are also on the radio. Anything from science fiction to old West shows, drama, horror, comedy, anything you want, news, sports, detectives, game shows. It was all on the radio. There was no TV, there was no internet. So if you're gonna have a story, it could be a book, it could be on the radio. And the first commercials did go on the air in the 20s. That's how radio was paid for. That's how television stations and on-the-air radio stations are still paid for. Because if they have a big audience, then advertisers will pay to put a commercial on there, knowing a lot of people will listen, and maybe some of them will buy your product. That's how it works. That's how it has always worked. So the better the shows, the more people listen, the more they can charge the advertisers. Because you don't have to pay to hear. I mean, yes, now there's cable and Sirius radio and stuff like that. But over the air is still free. It's still going out there right now. And it's free because you're not paying for it. Who's paying for it is the advertisers who are paying to have your eyeballs look at the screen. Now, here are a few mix of old radio shows, just the beginnings of a bunch of different shows. If any of these sound interesting, let me know. Most of these shows are online somewhere for free because they're old, not under copyright anymore, and you can listen to the whole thing. So if anything sounds interesting, let me know. These are just the beginnings of a little samplings of the many, many radio shows that aired back in the 1930s and 1940s.
Countdown for blast off. X minus 5, 4, 3, 2, X minus 1, fire. far horizons of the unknown come transcribed tales of new dimensions in time and space. These are stories of the future, adventures in which you'll live in a million, could be years, on 1,000 maybe worlds. The National Broadcasting Company presents X minus 1.
Dragnet. You're a detective sergeant. You're assigned to homicide detail. A small boy is reported missing from his home. His age, 9 years. Foul play is suspected. Your job, find him.
The Adventures of Ozzie and Harriet, transcribed and starring the entire Nelson family, Ozzie, Harriet, David, and Ricky. One of the interesting things about the Nelson household is that occasionally it's very quiet around the house. Now, for instance, you take the present moment. Harriet's in one of those rare moments of relaxation. She's usually the busy one, but right now she's sitting in a big easy chair doing a little knitting. I thought maybe we might pick up the click of the needles, but she's a pretty quiet knitter, too. I don't know where David and Ricky are, but that's Ozzie sitting over there in the bigger, easier chair. He's just taking it easy and in a pretty big way.
Suspense, radio's outstanding theater of thrills, is presented for your enjoyment by Roma Wines bring you Robert Taylor in a remarkable tale of suspense.
Who? I'm asking you, what's the guy's name on first base you give the money to?
Who? After all, the man's entitled to it.
Who is?
Yes. Sometimes his wife comes down and collects it.
Whose wife?
Yeah, sure.
All I'm trying to find out is what's the guy's name on first base?
What is on second base?
I'm not asking you who's on second.
Who's on first?
I don't know.
He's
Third
on
base.
first.
I know that.
With the speed of light, a cloud of dust, and a hearty hi-yo Silver, the Lone Ranger.
That whistle is your signal for the Signal Oil program, The Whistler.
Petri Wine brings you Basil Rathbone and Nigel Bruce in the new adventures of Sherlock Holmes.
The following transcribed program is rebroadcast by the Armed Forces Radio Service to our fighting men overseas. Goodyear presents The Roy Rogers Show.
Who knows what evil lurks in the hearts of men? The Shadow knows.
Once again, your neighborhood blue coal dealer brings you the thrilling adventures of the Shadow, the hard and relentless fight of one man against the forces of evil. These dramatizations are designed to demonstrate forcibly to old and young alike that crime does not pay.
From Hollywood, Colgate Tooth Powder presents The Mel Blanc Show with Mary Jane Croft, Joe Kearns, Hans Conried, Earl Ross, the sportsman, Victor Miller and his orchestra, and starring the creator of the voice of Bugs Bunny.
What's up, Doc?
Yes, Colgate Tooth Powder for a breath that's sweet and teeth that sparkle brings you The Mel Blanc Show with Mel playing his new character, Zookie.
Hello, everybody. Hello, everybody. Hi.
And starring himself in person, Mel Blanc.
Hi, folks. Ugga, ugga, boo, boo, ugga.
Lights out, everybody. Later than you think. Lights Out brings you stories of the supernatural and the supernormal, dramatizing the fantasies and the mysteries of the unknown. We tell you this frankly, so if you wish to avoid the excitement and tension of these imaginative plays, we urge you calmly, but sincerely, to turn off your radio now.
That's pretty cool, and the coolest, best radio show ever, IMO, was probably War of the Worlds by a young guy named Orson Welles. He had this idea. He had this show, and there was a show played right before Halloween in 1938, and he had this idea. Instead, there he is, Orson Welles. Instead of just kind of doing the story and have the actors do whatever, let's pretend it's actually happening. Let's have they did an old novel about an alien invasion called War of the Worlds, and he said, instead of just playing out the novel, let's pretend it's actually happening. Let's have breaking news updates about an alien invasion happening right now. And it kind of did scare people that it's actually taking place, because they did a good job with it. So I'm going to play just a little clip of a longer show. The whole show is like almost an hour long. I'm just going to play you like a 4-minute clip from it. And it's a really key scene. Earlier on in the show, they just started off like just playing music like it's a normal show on the radio on the evening. But then they keep breaking in saying, breaking news update. At first, people are seeing strange things happening on Mars. It's weird. There's like explosions on Mars. Isn't that weird? Let's go back to the music. And then a little while later, another breaking news update. A strange object landed on a farm in Grover's Mill, New Jersey, probably a meteor, and we're sending a reporter to the scene to give you a report. Now let's go back to music. And then they come back later, and then now it's a live reporter on the scene with his microphone describing what he sees. And that's where this clip comes in.
I wish I could convey the atmosphere, the background of this fantastic scene. Hundreds of cars are parked in a field in back of us, and the police are trying to rope off the roadway leading into the farm, but it's no use. They're breaking right through. The car's headlights throw an enormous spotlight on the pit where the object's half buried. Now, some of the more daring fellows now are venturing near the edge. Their silhouettes stand out against the metal sheet. One man wants to touch the thing. He's having an argument with the policeman. Now, the policeman wins. Now, ladies and gentlemen, there's something I haven't mentioned in all this excitement, but it's becoming more distinct. Perhaps you've caught it already on your radio. Listen, please. Do you hear it? It's a curious humming sound that seems to come from inside the object. I'll move the microphone nearer. Here. Now, we're not more than 25 feet away. Can you hear it now? Professor Pearson?
Yes, Professor.
Can you tell us the meaning of that scraping noise inside the thing?
Possibly the unequal cooling of its surface.
I say, do you still think it's a meteor, Professor?
I don't know what to think. The metal casing is definitely extraterrestrial. Not found on this Earth. Friction with the Earth's atmosphere usually tears holes in a meteorite. This thing is smooth, and you can see its cylindrical
Just a minute.
shape.
Something's happening. Ladies and gentlemen, this is terrific. This end of the thing is beginning to flake off. The top is beginning to rotate like a screw, and the thing must be hollow.
He's moving. Keep back there. Keep back there. Keep those men back. Keep back there. Keep those idiots back. Keep off. The top floor. Look out there. Stand back.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is the most terrifying thing I've ever witnessed. Wait a minute. Something I can see coming out of that black hole, two luminous discs. The eyes, it might be a face, might be almost... Good heavens, something wriggling out of the shadow like a gray snake. Now it's another one, and another one, and another one. They look like tentacles to me. I can see the thing's body now. It's large as a bear. It glistens like wet leather, but that face, ladies and gentlemen, it's indescribable. I can hardly force myself to keep looking at it. It's so awful. The eyes are black, and they gleam like a serpent. The mouth is kind of V-shaped with saliva dripping from its rimless lips. It seems to quiver and pulsate, and the monster, or whatever it is, can hardly move. It seems weighed down by possibly gravity or something. The thing's rising up now, and the crowd falls back. It seems plenty. The most extraordinary experience, ladies and gentlemen. I can't find words. Well, I'll pull this microphone with me as I talk. I'll have to stop the description until I can take a new position. Hold on, will you please? I'll be right back in a minute.
We are bringing you an eyewitness account of what's happening on the Wilmuth Farm, Grover's Mill, New Jersey. We now return you to Carl Phillips at Grover's Mill.
Ladies and gentlemen, am I on? Ladies and gentlemen, here I am, back of a stone wall that adjoins Mr. Wilmuth's garden. From here, I get a sweep of the whole scene. I'll give you every detail as long as I can talk and as long as I can see. More state police have arrived. They're drawing up a cordon in front of the pit. About 30 of them. No need to push the crowd back now. They're willing to keep their distance. The captain's conferring with someone. Can't quite see who. Ah, yes, I believe it's Professor Pearson. Yes, it is. Now they've parted, and the professor moves around one side, studying the object while the captain and two policemen advance with something in their hands. I can see it now. It's a white handkerchief tied to a pole. Flag of truce. If those preachers know what that means, what anything means. Wait a minute, something's happening. A humped shape is rising out of the pit. I can make out a small beam of light against a mirror. What's that? There's a jet of flame springing from the mirror, and it leaps right at the advancing men. It strikes them head on. Lord, they're turning into flames. The whole field's caught up by the woods, the barns, the gas tanks of the automobiles spreading everywhere. It's coming this way now, about 20 yards to my right.
Ladies and gentlemen, due to circumstances beyond our control, we are unable to continue the broadcast from Grover's Mill. Evidently, there's some difficulty with our field transmission. However, we will return to that point at the earliest opportunity. We continue now with our piano interlude.
Ladies and gentlemen, I've just been handed a message that came in from Grover's Mill by telephone. Just one moment, please. At least 40 people, including 6 state troopers, lie dead in a field east of the village of Grover's Mill.
That's pretty cool, however. Radio did not last. Video killed the radio star, like the old song goes. It was really popular in the 40s and into the 50s, but what happened was TV. TV has been invented back in the 20s, but it was really expensive, and then the war came, and so people weren't putting a lot of engineering into making a better TV set until after the war. And then in the late 1940s, TVs really advanced a lot. They became a lot cheaper and a lot better. And by like 1950 or so, more people could afford them, and more stations are going on the air. And the numbers are pretty staggering. In 1950, only about 10% of Americans had a TV in their house. By 1960, it was 90%. And those people who were staring at the TV were no longer listening to the radio to get their entertainment. The radio had news and sports, and music, basically how it is today. All those radio shows kind of faded away. And in 1962 were the last 2 shows went off the radio. Some of them, they made a TV version of Suspense that wasn't that great. If you ever heard of a show called The Twilight Zone, that's kind of like Suspense. It's kind of similar to the old radio shows. But the radio shows versions were all gone by 1962. And the golden age of TV had come. So now the family sat around in their mid-century modern living room staring at the glowing television box, not the radio anymore. Even if there were static. I mean, maybe there's something in the static. Maybe aliens are sending us a message in there. Don't stare too long. Anyway, back to the 30s real quick. So there's your quick trip through Radio Land. Going back to the 30s, though, as people were listening to all these funny or scary or whatever radio shows, things were happening in Europe. Things were happening in Asia. Bad things. Germany was threatening to attack their neighbors. Japan actually did start to attack their neighbors. And eventually the United States would have to get involved, but that's a story for next time. So I'm glad you listened. Now's a good time to take your SB quiz on the first part of the 20th century. And again, no details, but hopefully remember the big picture. Talk to you next time.